Welcome to another Marin Master Gardener program sponsored by Marin County Free Library. And we're very pleased to have Jim Kasper with us. Jim has been a Master Gardener since 2011. He has special interests in California natives, garden planning, and plant selection for fire risk mitigation and defensible space. And Jim and I were just talking about a fire that came within a quarter mile of his house. And since then, he has been working with other county agencies, the GGNRA, Marin County Parks, the Marin chapter of the California Native Plant Society, and fire agencies in Marin, because it's a very important topic and we can use all the advice we can get. So thank you, Jim, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Linda, and I'd like to thank the Marin County Free Library for sponsoring and holding this, organizing this session, and for Linda being, to some extent, the moderator and assisting at the end with dealing with the questions that come up in chat. So I am going to share my screen to start the presentation. A couple logistical suggestions. Linda will probably be taking care of keeping everybody muted just to minimize background noise. As she mentioned, use the chat function for submitting any questions. We'll deal with them at the end of the session. Recommend that you do turn your video off. It'll just help with consumption of the internet connection speeds for yourself in particular, but everybody else as well. If you're unable to hear the presentation, do check your systems that your speakers are properly selected. If you have any significant problems, you may need to exit and rejoin. Linda will be monitoring the waiting room and let people in as we proceed. As Linda mentioned, we'll be talking about Fire Smart Landscaping. This is a program that Marin Master Gardeners, in one form or another, have actually been doing for a number of years, but really sort of consolidated into the current program about 2 years ago. A little bit of background on Master Gardeners. Basically, we are trained volunteers, residents of Marin County, who are taught and learn knowledge and skills to share that information with the public. We are officially non-paid members of the University of California Cooperative Extension, which goes throughout the state of California. And as I mentioned, to provide support for the home gardener. There's in general, a Master Gardener organization in each of the counties, or at least representing each of the counties in California. In Marin, there are about 350 to 380 Master Gardeners active. We typically end up going through about an 18-week training class initially, which, as Linda mentioned, I went through in 2011. And at that point in time, we have requirements to both keep up with our education as well as to provide volunteer services for the home gardener. One of the foundations for Master Gardeners and for this particular aspect of Fire Smart Landscaping is to realize that our gardens and landscapes, we really need to keep in mind environmental health of them. And that involves making sure that the biodiversity of the garden is maintained, increasing the and monitoring the ecological sensitivity, everything from pollinators to water usage and so on. But also realize that people are members of the habitat as well, and all of that, for all those reasons, it is worth preserving that environment and enhancing it as much as possible. So what we'll cover briefly at the beginning, since I think many of you probably have been through some presentation from Fire Safe Marin or other organizations about fire, but just to give you some fire facts to make sure everybody's sort of at the same level. and then talk about planning and maintaining a fire smart landscape. And maybe what you're looking for the most is at the end, talk about some specific actions you can do at home, especially if we look forward over the next couple of months. Why is this all important now? There's a number of things that have occurred. Basically, California wildfires are becoming more frequent. If you keep track of them, I mean, the fire season in the past, when around the time that Linda mentioned in 2004 with the fire near my house, it typically was maybe from June to late October. You talk to anybody in the fire agency now, and they'll say it's essentially a year-round consideration. They are more intense. There's a number of characteristics that I'll talk about in terms of the intensity and frequency of the fires, and they're more destructive. And to give you some examples, if you look at the 20 most destructive fires in California, 13 of them have occurred in the last 4 years. That is since 2017. If you look at the 20 deadliest fires, 6 of those have occurred in the last 4 years. And if you look at the 20 largest fires in terms of area impacted, 8 of those were in the last 4 years. And in fact, the top 7 have occurred in the last 4 years. So this has been an impact to California for over a period of time, but it seems to be increasing over time as well. One of the things to keep in mind that in Marin County, about 80% of the geography of Marin is considered to be anywhere from moderate to very high fire hazard. And if you look at what's called the wildland urban interface, which is where many of the houses in Marin are located, about 65% of the living units in Marin County are within that wildland urban interface and potentially impacted by the fire risk in those areas. So why is this happening? Number of different reasons. Some of it is human activity in terms of fire ignition. We end up with more wildland vegetation. If you look back at fire history and the way fire agencies have approached managing fires going back to about the early 1900s, the intention was to try to suppress fires as quickly as possible. The more current view is that was probably an incorrect approach, and the desire would be to let low-level fires, that is, fires at the ground level, consume the lower level vegetation so that it doesn't build up so much that it essentially affects the larger vegetation in our different areas. And we, and human beings, are moving more into that wildland urban interface, so we're sort of sticking ourselves into the line of fire, no pun intended. In addition, you've got various climate change factors that have been occurring, more heat, more wind, less moisture, and probably more importantly, inconsistent, like the drought that we are currently experiencing in California, but specifically in Marin County. Some examples that if you look at the hottest days in California, and you go back to the early 1900s, that hottest day has increased by almost 2 degrees basically the last 120 years. In addition, the number of fog hours of fog during the summertime has declined about 3 hours per day. So less moisture, less cooling effect from the fog. And another factor that affects plant selection to some extent is that there are now 19 fewer frost-free days. There are 19 more frost-free days in California today than there were about 100 years ago. So generally trends showing that the environment is getting warmer. One additional factor I added recently is just unusual weather, and by that I mean keep in mind the essentially what I will call the lightning storm that hit all of California last year and basically initiated a lot of the fires that we experienced in late 2020. Well, how do landscapes and homes end up catching fire? the first thing people think about is direct flame, you know, a wall of flame that approaches the house and consumes the house. In reality, it is one of the lower percentages of how a structure will end up catching fire. The other option is radiant heat. An example of that would be one house catching on fire and the heat being strong enough that because another house is nearby, just by radiant heat, that adjacent house gets warm enough and it catches on fire. The experience have shown that in reality, somewhere at least 60%, if not up to 80 or 90% of the fires where structures catch on fire is actually caused by ember storms. And as you probably have heard in the past, those can be created from a fire that could be up to a mile away. And essentially think of it as a snowstorm of embers that end up piling up around structures. And one thing leads to another and causes a structure to catch on fire. So I'll just give you two examples of extremes. This house, if you look at it, not touched at all by fire, yet all the vegetation around it has been burned up, and you'd ask the question, well, what did they do? Some of it is the home hardening that the house occupants had done, but there's some other aspects we'll talk about in a minute that made a difference. And on the other hand, here's a case where all the vegetation around the house is green, the fire's out, but the entire structure has been burned out. And you sort of try to look at these two and try to resolve them. And again, we'll talk about some of the things that could be impacting these two situations. Keep in mind that a point to keep in mind is that fire moves vertically. By that, and this is important when you're talking about landscape considerations, that a flame can rise anywhere from 2 to 3 times above the height of whatever is being consumed. That means if you have a 2-foot tall shrub, the flames could be 4 to 6 feet above that. In other words, 8 feet above the ground. And that's just something to keep in mind as you start figuring out landscape design and other factors. Another point to keep in mind that's related to that is what the fire agencies call fire ladders. That is a fire that starts off in the grasslands, for example, which would be very dry, potentially very, very light fuel. It catches on fire very easily from embers, but then there are shrubs nearby that are very close to the ground. Those in turn catch on fire because of the flames from the grass, and that continues into the larger vegetation, trees and so on. And if there's enough of those large plants around, what you end up with is, what people would call a crown fire, so a massive fire is some of the examples that you probably have all been aware of over the last several years. Another factor to keep in mind, and it's obviously, it can impact different parts of Marin County, is that fire moves rapidly uphill. In fact, some people will say it is the only thing in nature that moves faster uphill. And basically, it's a number of reasons. The wind accelerates, you end up with glowing embers. The fire down below preheats the vegetation up above, and the fire moves very rapidly uphill. And you have to look at ways of trying to break that flow, if you will. And one of the things to do is to try to space out the vegetation, keep it down low so that you don't get tall plants creating, down below, very dense, causing a lot of embers, which then spread further up the hill. Looking back on all of our education in grade school, you know that there are 3 components that are needed to have fire. And of these, there is only one that we can control, which is fuel. And keep in mind that fuel is basically anything that can be consumed, which could be plants to your house, to other items around your property. So you want to keep in mind from these pictures some of the obvious stuff: cut down the grass, keep trees pruned away from the house, try to minimize the density of the vegetation, but also look at those things that are around your house that are not necessarily in the landscape, but that could end up being the tinder that causes other items to catch on fire. So we'll talk a little, we'll focus on planning for a fire, what we call a fire, we in Master Gardeners call a fire smart landscape. I should mention that there are a number of things that can be done from a structure point of view, what's referred to as home hardening. If you're looking for any information regarding home hardening, the best place in my mind to look is at the Fire Safe Marin website. Fire Safe Marin is the Marin County Fire Safe Council. Very extensive information from tips and hints to publications and videos as well about various aspects of home hardening. So related to that, the recommendation is to start at the house and work your way out. Initially, the point would be don't worry about that tree or that shrub that's 50 or 100 feet away from the house. What you really want to be concerned about is embers getting close to the house and causing the house on fire. If you do want to look at home hardening points, some of the things to keep in mind are keeping the area, improving the area of your roof, the eaves and the gutters, basically starting at the top of the house and work down, with one exception that I'll get into in a minute. But then also look at what I'll call ancillary parts of what's on your property, whether it's your patio, your deck, fences that connect to the wooden fences that connect to the house. If you do have water supply on your property, make sure that it's available. And probably one of the more important things, and also one of the simplest things to do, is reflective address numbers. If you've seen any of the videos of fires, even during the daytime, it is nearly impossible to see anything. It's so dark. The reflective address numbers can make a big difference. So keeping that in mind, you probably should contact your local fire department for any tips and hints, and also know your evacuation route. I will mention one thing here, for those of you who are familiar with the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, which was established basically officially July of 2020 as a result of Measure C that was passed in Marin County. They are implementing, and all of the participating fire agencies, what are called wildfire mitigation specialists. Those people will be trained and available to do essentially property inspections, not with the intention of a citation, but basically to provide the property owner tips and hints of improvements that could be done over a period of time. So keep in mind that you may be hearing more about what are called the wildfire mitigation specialists from your local fire agency. When you look at from a landscape point of view, what are the key areas that people may refer to? Initially, what a lot of people referred to was zone 1 and 2, which was essentially out to 30 feet for zone 1, and then beyond that to 100 feet for zone 2. As a result of the fires over the last several years, there's been more of a focus on what's now being referred to as zone 0, or the non-combustible zone. And that's probably the area that should be looked at first if you're going to do anything in terms of your preparation to minimize risk from fire. Beyond that, zone 3 are access to your property, whether your driveway or road, and making sure vegetation is cleared there, and then farther out any out structures in zone 4. So what is it about zone 0? That's 0 to 5 feet. Basically, what you should be looking at is cleanup in that area. That's where I would start first. No dead branches. Keep the roof and your gutters clear of litter, and branches away 10 feet from chimney and from the roof. One of the recommendations specifically I'd make in terms of gutter litter and roof litter, a lot of people end up cleaning that up in the probably October timeframe because they're getting ready for the rainy season. I would propose that it be done maybe one other time before that, and that is sort of August timeframe for fire concerns to minimize the litter that's on the roof. and in the gutters. Also, from a planning point of view, you want to minimize tall plants that are under eaves or under windows. You'd like to avoid combustible material that's attached to the house, like a fence. And specifically from a landscape point of view, avoid the use of any combustible mulch in that 0 to 5 foot area. And just a couple photo examples, what looks like, initially, 3 years ago, people might say, gee, this looks great from a fire smart landscape point of view. Given the more current knowledge, there are actually 2 places that would be of concern. That vine or shrub on the right-hand side that's right up against the patio window. If that caught on fire, or if the debris under it caught on fire, it could potentially break the glass in the patio window, and you'd end up getting intrusion of embers inside the house, and essentially the house was burned from the inside out. That item on the left, which looks almost like a Japanese maple, wouldn't necessarily suggest removal of that, but be conscious of keeping it trimmed away from the house, again, from a fire safety point of view. Another example, again, people might think, gee, it looks great. Not a lot of nearby planting, but again, you've got a vine that's actually growing up into onto the roof. If a fire did start and went up that vine, it could get into the roof that way. Those 2 trellises in the back, not clear how close they are to the house, but anything that's growing on them, if they are very close to the house, could create a risk situation for the property. Well, what kind of plants and what kind of material are recommended for that 0 to 5 feet? Basically, from a mulch point of view, the recommendation is non-combustible material, whether it's stone, pavers, decomposed granite. You can create some very interesting designs by using some combinations. One other factor to keep in mind is that if you do that, it actually makes maintenance of the siding of your house a little bit easier. Minimizes maybe any risks of the impact of the plants brushing up against the house, taller plants. If you're looking for planting, the recommendation would be succulents or any low-growing herbaceous, non-woody, and well-irrigated plant. A consideration this year, given the low rainfall that we've experienced in Marin, would almost probably suggest not doing any planting or new planting, or at least doing it very judiciously to minimize new water demands. Most plants will require, in a new planting environment, additional water to get them well established and growing properly. So why the 0 to 5 feet? What other things can happen? Well, these are some examples of debris building up around the base of a house or in the gutter. If you look at it and you think of it, if you were out camping someplace, a lot of that material looks like the kind of thing you'd use as tinder to start a fire, and that's exactly what would end up taking place in an active fire situation with a lot of embers flying around. In terms of the actual structure, the recommendations would be, in terms of keeping the growing material away from the house, even if you have stucco or some kind of more fire-resistant siding, the reality is you've got backing material on the side of the house, and it's also true on the roof, that if some tinders, some fine material caught fire, it could have essentially, the flames could essentially reach behind the siding or underneath the roof and cause the fire to actually get behind those fire-resistant materials. Just an embarrassing example from my own house. Pile of leaves, bunch of rocks that are up against the house, looks great, concrete on the base. But if those leaves caught fire, there's probably enough there that it would actually catch the wooden siding and essentially start a fire on the side of the A live example from a fire where that area that scorched was actually wood mulch. Uh, Nearby fire and embers basically started that on fire. Obviously didn't impact the green grass, did impact the shrubs that are there as well, but they're still living. However, you look closely at the siding, assuming it's some kind of vinyl siding, obviously warped the siding and may have even caused problems with some of the windows nearby. So just an example of what can happen if you don't take the right steps to protect the side of do the right things in that 0 to 5 foot area. Well, what do you do about beyond that? There's distinctions between what are called zones 1 and zone 2, but from a landscape point of view, in general, there's relatively few distinctions that would make a difference. The one thing to keep in mind is the closer to the house, what you want to do is have the lower and well irrigated plants. So it would minimize the risk of the fire spreading horizontally from out there to closer to the house. When you get further away, larger trees and shrubs are perfectly fine. And when you get out beyond 30 feet, the use of wood mulch is also, it should not be that much of a problem. If you have wood mulch in that zone 1, I would be careful about that and try to minimize how widespread it is to minimize, again, the fire starting in one section and moving throughout the entire set of that mulched area. As you look at your yard, look at things you can do that would basically provide fuel breaks between plantings, whether that's areas to walk, decomposed gravel for a pathway, any number of things that would basically break up the planting so that if a fire started in one section, it won't spread easily to another. The benefit it also provides is you end up with those, quote, fuel breaks, the ability to maintain the yard a lot better, both the plantings as well as the irrigation in the yard. And just keep in mind, based on the comments earlier, you want to make sure there's appropriate vertical and horizontal spacing between different groups of plants, but then also from a vertical point of view, between shrubs and trees, and especially when you're looking at slopes to minimize the risk of fire moving quickly up the slope. And the last thing, the recommendation, and if you're familiar with the Firewise program, the National Firewise program, which is pretty active in Marin County, is working with your neighbors, having your house be as wonderful as possible from a fire risk point of view. Doesn't necessarily work all that well if you've got a lot of problems nearby. And so working with your neighbors, setting an example, you can actually make the entire neighborhood much safer. Again, I just want to review a couple examples. Looks like a really nice landscape that people would consider to be fire smart. That's true on the right-hand side. One shrub in the back I'm a little concerned about, giving its proximity both to the siding as well as underneath that window. Another case, same kind of, similar kind of situation. Looks really nice. The front area, both the circled area as well as the area to the left of it outside the circle looks fine. That what looks like a fortnight lily being up against the house would be of concern because that particular plant can also build up a lot of debris inside the plant. And again, this is just an example of, from a distance point of view, a nice landscape in more of a chaparral kind of environment. Well, then, keeping those design factors in mind, what should I consider in terms of what plants to choose? Well, from the point of view, from a scientific point of view, for master gardeners, there really is no safe plant list. You can find plants that may have less of a risk, but the reality is that all plants burn. So does that mean they got to be really careful? And do I just, denude everything? Well, the reality is beyond that is that that doesn't mean all plants are bad. And a lot of what is going to make a difference, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, is both maintenance and design and placement. when you're choosing plants, one a strong recommendation for master gardeners is not just look at it from a fire safety or a water use or any one single component factor about why you're doing something or selecting that particular plant, but consider a number of factors. The health of the environment. The plants provide home to insects and then in turn birds and other animals, and that could be both from a true nesting point of view, but also just as shelter. For both, depending on what's in the garden, it can provide food for us if you've got some kind of vegetable garden, but also it actually provides an environment that gives food to all of the other all the other fauna, if you will, that live in the garden. And going back again to elementary school, the plants provide oxygen. In a lot of cases, they also reduce pollution. Keeping the plants in place sequesters carbon as opposed to trying to remove the plants. With the right design, you can reduce water runoff and therefore reduce erosion. And once all the work is done, and you get a chance to actually relax, and actually can provide an environment that reduces stress, especially the challenges we've been going through over the last 1 year plus. So what do you look for? From a master gardener point of view, in a broad sense, it's the right plant in the right place. Understand what it is you're trying to accomplish in identifying a place to put a plant, and determine what those characteristics are for that location. Could be any number of factors. Could be that it's in a grouping of plants that you want to have very low water use. Alternatively, you may pick an area that you want to, it may be where you have a low spot in your yard. Water tends to sit there for a while, even in dry conditions, and you want to have similar plants living in that kind of environment that can tolerate a little bit more moisture. Consider the aspect of the insects and birds and other animals in the environment, especially being pollinator friendly. There's a lot of plants that will demonstrate that capability. From a gardener personal point of view, I would say you also want it to be well behaved in order to some extent, minimize the effort that you have to maintain that particular plant. You don't want it to be invasive where it spreads rapidly and you're having to do a lot of work to do that. And likewise, you don't want it to create a lot of dead and dying material that just continually demands maintenance on your part. Just want to reemphasize, we are not talking about creating the picture on the right. We know that you can create the picture on the left and end up being having a landscape that is both attractive and also, in a broad sense, very functional around your property. Well, if you selected the plants, and I'm essentially, in essence, saying you've got a very wide palette to choose from. I would emphasize that I would lean more towards California natives, if at all possible, for a number of reasons I'll talk about in a minute. But you've got a wide palette, but really look at it from a function point of view, where you're going to place it. Well, then once you're doing that, what's involved? There are basically these 4 factors to consider, which we'll spend a few minutes talking about, which is whatever plants you have in your yard today, what you probably should do is concentrate on cleaning it up. Look at the water demands for the plant and throughout your yard, determine what needs to happen in order to optimize the use of water. Look at the appropriate use of mulch at different locations in your plant that are in your yard. That will help both from a weed control point of view, but also retention of moisture within the soil to make it a little bit easier again for you to maintain. And as part of the cleanup, look at what things you can do in order to prune the plants that you do have. So in the cleanup area, Some of the early easy things that I would recommend doing is look at pulling weeds. Remove the dead material that's around, which is leaves and needles. I'm not necessarily saying all the leaves need to be cleaned up. I'll just pass along that one of the anticipating the question. Recommendations under oaks is that you should leave the fallen oak leaves on the ground. We're not saying to change that. Consider where the oak is, what else is in the neighborhood, and perhaps leaving the leaves there is appropriate. Clear the gutters and the rooftop of any debris that's around. In my area, there's a fair number of eucalyptus, and you often get the debris from the eucalyptus, and so it has to be done on a pretty regular basis, maybe every couple of months or so. Avoid planting anything under the deck or having material stored under the deck, but I'll just focus on the planting side of it. What you don't want to do is have a plant under the deck catch fire and, under wildfire kind of situation, and end up having the deck then in turn catch on fire. As you get later into the summer, avoid mowing on hot or windy days. If you need to do it early in the day when hopefully it's cooler and calmer. Keep your wood piles at least 30 feet away from structures. For those of you who maybe have a fireplace and say, well, during the wintertime, what do I do? Well, then during the wintertime, you're going to probably have a much moister environment, hopefully more than what we've had this past year. Well, having the wood nearby is fine, but when we start getting to this time of the year, sort of late March, early April, considering moving that wood pile further away from the structure. In general, any combustible items away from the house, and that includes your garbage bins. What you don't want to do is have them catch on fire as a result of any wildfire, and then in turn causing a fire to start in some structure on your property. If you do have a generator, ideally keep it 30 feet away. For those of you with propane tanks, large propane tanks specifically, not necessarily the ones that you use for your grill, you want to keep those also quite a distance from your structures. Well, what does that mean? Well, in this picture you've got on the left, you can see dense planting. You can actually potentially see a fire starting somewhere within that vegetation and just basically spreading throughout that entire, all the vegetation in that photo. The picture on the lower right, quite the opposite. Start a fire in any one of the places and it may consume that particular grouping of plants, but it's not going to spread, or not going to spread easily to the rest of the vegetation or to the structure. For watering, it's very important to maintain your irrigation system, and this will be extremely important this year. You probably know that both of the water districts the big water districts serving Marin County are considering some level of water reduction, and likely to, in my opinion, likely to be mandatory. Decisions will probably, based on articles I've seen in the IJ, decisions will probably come up at meetings in April. You want to keep the plants properly hydrated. That keeps the fire resistance to a minimum. If we're going to have to cut back on water at all, it doesn't mean it's going to go away entirely. But one consideration is under just regular daily conditions, you just do it on some kind of a schedule that just keeps the plants surviving and alive. What you might consider under a potential red flag condition, keep in mind when that happens, and that may be a time to turn your irrigation system on for a period just to get the plants hydrated in case there is any kind of fire nearby. For mulch, different mulches depending on where in the yard you want to apply it. If you're talking 0 to 5 feet, it's ideally non-combustible. As I mentioned earlier, stones or decomposed gravel or concrete blocks, whatever. You go a little bit further away, preferably composted wood chips so it's not dry wood chips, but things that have actually decomposed a little bit, so they're a little less combustible. But then also any non-combustible material, like DG is decomposed granite. When you go to 30 feet or beyond, larger composted wood chips are perfectly fine. That's everything from the sort of 1/4, 1/2 inch diameter to the sort of fist-sized wood chips. Under any condition, I would avoid using the very fine and stringy mulches, what some people refer to as gorilla hair, because that's just like tinder if you wanted to start a fire, you know, when you're out camping. Um, from the amount of material, for a variety of reasons, not just from a fire point of view, anything more than 2 inches is probably not desirable, but that should be enough to keep your plants hydrated, any moisture within the soil, and also, frankly, also keep the soil a little bit cooler on the warmer days. For pruning, recommendations are, what some people refer to as the 4Ds. If you look at a plant and you're trying to decide what pruning to do, and I would almost do this in 4 steps, if you will. Look at the dead branches and remove those. Look at the diseased branches and determine what the right way is to remove those. Look at anything that's damaged in some way, maybe broken or whatever, partway up the branch, and remove those appropriately. And then aesthetically, look at what some people refer to as the deranged aspects of the plant, where you get crossing branches or whatever. And if you do it gradually, maybe over a period of 4 different days, 4 weekends, you'll gradually improve the plant and be well on your way to having a more fire smart plant at that location. For any trees, the recommendation is 6 to 15 feet above ground. If you've got shorter trees, nothing more than 1/3 of the height above ground of the total height of the tree or the shrub. Avoid topping trees. Some people do that for various visual reasons. The challenge is that just causes more problems in the future, excess branching, and just more work in the future. In that kind of a situation, it is probably not the right plant in that particular location, and may be worthwhile considering removal and changing at some point in time. All of this begins with the plants, both in terms of being fire smart, but in a broad aspect of building and sustaining a healthy garden. You keep it in sync with the environment. You've got plants that you can maintain, that various aspects, the animals and insects in the garden can take advantage of it. Could be easier from a maintenance and an irrigation point of view. As I mentioned earlier, I would strongly recommend considering California natives. One good resource is the Marin chapter of the California Native Plant Society. On their website has a list. They have 6 groupings of types of plants to replace, for example, tall plants, tall trees, and recommendations of California natives in each of those. There's a lot of information on the Marin Master Gardener website about different plant alternatives as well. So there's a lot of resources that you can do research on that reflect specifically the Marin environment. The point I want to stress here is that the process is gradual, and you're going to look at some of these, and this is do as I say, not as I do. That's actually a picture of our backyard. Just as background, 40 years ago when we moved here, that entire backyard was French broom over my head. Gotten a number of oak tree volunteers. That one is right, it's downhill below the deck. It's been there. It was probably there at the time we moved in. Somebody might say, well, should I remove that? Well, our decision is to keep it. You know, we want that tree to grow big enough that it's going to be less of a risk, even if there was a fire at the ground level. On the other hand, this is the south side of our house with a number of ceanothus growing. Unfortunately, not the right plant in the right place. I'm leaving it there for now. It is just absolutely covered with both native as well as honeybees. And at some point later this year, we'll look at taking, especially the one on the right, taking it out and planting something lower since it's right up against the house and under the deck. So in summary, 0 to 5 feet, minimize combustible material, low growing, well irrigated plants, ground covers. Again, there's a variety of options available for you. In zone 1 and 2, keep in mind shorter plants closer to home, larger plants, maybe denser spacing farther away. Wood mulch is okay beyond 30 feet and beyond from the house. Where possible, landscape, a hardscape between plantings for fuel breaks that also gives you the ability to maintain the plants and the irrigation system a little bit easier. And that involves both the appropriate vertical and well as horizontal spacing between shrubs and trees. And then keep in mind, boy, this is interesting here. Keep in mind in general, defensible space going beyond your property to work with your neighbors. So maintaining it in the 4 categories we talked about. Keep in mind that a lot of things can burn. So as we say in Master Gardeners, don't be foolish. Watch out for the possibility of something actually being fuel in case there was a fire. Properly maintain your irrigation system. The right kind of mulch at the right spot within your yard, and maintain that spacing between the plants and your structures. And I'll give you a couple specific actions if you wanted a to-do list. The first thing I'd recommend is, especially with this nice weekend coming up, is simply do a walk about your property. Take notes. Given the material we talked about, don't expect it to be 100% inclusive. And identify those things you think that would be appropriate in taking some action. Make a plan to prepare for dealing with any material you want to cut and remove. Obviously, the green bin is an option. It's not been totally made announced yet, but the Fire Safe Marin, along with the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority for the 17 fire agencies that are part of the authority in Marin County, there will be chipper days scheduled, I think, starting in late May. It'll be based on your particular address. There'll be a website that you can sign up, and they'll come back and confirm essentially what week you would get that service. But in anticipation of that, as you're doing that walkabout, keep that in mind, because you may say, well, gee, I want to move this plant and it's awful big and I'm not sure how I'd get rid of the material over a period of time. Well, you find out what that chipper day event's going to be, and you may plan on that work to cut that thing out and put it by the street side at the appropriate time to take advantage of the chipper day. One of the other first things to do also would be that area 0 to 5 feet. That's the area of most concern to the fire agencies. Clean up the litter, and especially look at any plantings to remove anything to do with those, what I mentioned, the 4 Ds. If you want more information, as I mentioned, look at the Fire Safe Marin website. That's the URL for the website. You can use that QR code on the right side. That'll take you right to the website if you've got a smartphone. Prior to the beginning of last year, and hopefully sometime maybe later this year, there will be phone support that is not available right now. If you have any questions, you can send an email to that to the help desk at marinmg.org. The help desk, if it was open, would be at that location in Novato. Again, that's shut down for COVID concern reasons. but again, may end up opening up later this year. Master Gardeners do have a free newsletter that's emailed approximately quarterly. If you look at the website, you look at the Ask Us section, you can sign up for that. One other point I want to mention is that there is a service that's been in place for a number of years, co-sponsored by the North Marin as well as Marin Municipal Water Districts. It's a garden walk, visit by two master gardeners to your home, and they'll walk around giving you tips on what you can do in order to improve the irrigation in your landscape. I mentioned earlier the wildfire mitigation specialists. Over the next year or so, those people will be coming around to look at individual properties as well. So keep in touch with your fire district to determine when that might take place at your location. There's a number of Fire Smart resources. We'll make sure that that's available to you as a result of this presentation. And I think with that, Linda, it's question and answer time.
Okay, we have some questions. So you did mention oak tree leaves. And what, if you're not blowing them out, why wouldn't you? Why would you leave them?
I missed the beginning of the question again.
Oh, sorry. So someone has a lot of oak trees far enough from the home, but they still make a mess with the leaves. And they wondered if they could plant something under them that would be easy to get rid of the leaves.
Boy, I'm not sure I can come up with a specific recommendation. There are, you got to be careful with what you plant underneath an oak. Because typically, most of the things people think of planting underneath oaks need water. And that's probably during the summertime, and that's basically a long-term death knell for the oak tree. My recommendation would be to keep it as sparse as possible. I'd have to do some research to determine whether there's a particular plant that would make some sense. Mr. Maselli, who's also a master gardener, I'm going to put him on the spot and ask if he has any particular recommendations, as I know he's got a yard with a lot of oaks in it.
Geez, I couldn't hide out.
You're right at the top, Bob.
Well, there's two things about leaves under oak trees. Actually, the leaves there are the natural mulch for oaks, and oaks that have leaves under them are more healthy and less diseased than leaves where they're removed. And so it's important to keep them. You don't have to keep it very deep, 2 to 3, 4 inches, and then you can remove them. The second piece on is if you will Google planting under oak trees, plants for under oak trees, there's an excellent sort of pamphlet on the internet that will give you a good list of plants that you can plant under oak trees. They are summer drought plants, so you don't have to, once they're established, you won't have to water them very much, and that will keep both the oaks happy and the plants happy. They need shade. Ribes, for example, wild currant is one that will work there. They're very healthy and easy to grow, and they are fully compatible with the oaks.
Thank you, Bob.
I'm going to hide again.
Another question.
I'm going to just add one other thing, Linda, sorry. One of the recommendations when people talk about, well, where should I plant something? Or, I've got this plant I want to put in. Generally, the recommendation is if you're out for a walk, look at what the environment is out in nature. And you can probably find examples just by doing that. Sorry.
Oh, good answer. What do you think about the plant, the pride of Madeira? The questioners heard it's invasive, but the bees and the hummingbirds love it, and when it's blooming in spring, would it be good 10 to 30 feet out or more than 30 feet out? Or?
So it is, there are, it's an Echium, I think the genus is Echium. There are several varieties of it. The one that is referred to as Pride of Madeira, I think, is considered more invasive than some of the others. You're right, lovely blue flowers, lots of bee activity. I could go back to that picture I showed you of the ceanothus that are in my yard. I would say what that is doing is generally providing the same benefit from a bee, a pollinator point of view. It is a California native. It's blooming essentially at the same time. I would put that higher on the list from a recommendation point of view. One of the biggest concerns from a fire risk point of view I have about the Pride of Madeira is what happens 3 months from now. It ends up being very woody if it's not maintained properly. You end up essentially having a potential torch. And that's almost more of my concern than anything else about that particular plant.
Another question is, what is a good ground cover replacement for mulch or town bark on a large area of uneven sloping ground? It's a play yard in their back area. It's in the shade of redwoods where the grass won't grow.
There are a number of native grass-like plants. I'll have to do some research and maybe come up with a specific answer to that. But there's a number of native grass-like plants that provide the aspect of what looks like a lawn. If you're looking for something that isn't going to have a lot of activity, and I mean like school playground kind of activity, there are a lot of options that are available if you do want people to be able to go on that particular area. Alternatively, if it's basically low ground cover, but there is not a lot of people activity or animal activity, there are plenty of low growing, especially California natives, that could be planted. Ceanothus, there's Bacchus, coyote bush, a number of plants that maybe grow 6 to 8 inches tall, spread very well. Again, they're not there for people to walk on or walk through, but that would be an alternative. And depending on the layout, you could end up mixing plants like that with some of the lower growing grasses. And hopefully I can get the information to get back to the person asking the question and provide some specific suggestions for plants.
Sure. The last question we have so far is, what do you think about the new greenbelt median on Red Hill Avenue between United Market and the Hub? Is that kind of arrangement, would that be good in a 5 feet and further out zone of your yard?
I live in southern Marin, and I've not seen that particular area.
Oh, it's actually quite lovely. It's a big improvement over what was there.
Well, I will give I'll give an answer that's related to something closer to me. About 3 or 4 years ago, Miller Avenue, which runs essentially from, if you will, the main entrance into Mill Valley, they redesigned the median. Another place I'll mention that maybe sort of have some commonality is the work that was done actually at the Bonaire Shopping Center. You got, first of all, they've accommodated a situation where any water runoff is actually going to run into the green area. It's not going to just run into the street drains. There's plants that are typically lower. They're going to be able to take that water during the rainy season, but they're also going to accommodate drier conditions later in the summertime. Essentially, if what is at that location by Red Hill is lower growing plants, spaced enough with the right kind of mulch in between. If you're going to do them by your house, I would suspect that they're fine. One factor I would just keep in mind is the ultimate height of the plant and its width. And if you have, for example, a window near where the plant is located, you want to make sure that if for some reason that plant caught on fire, it wouldn't cause the window to break, and therefore an ember entry into the house.
Well, unless anyone has any more questions, I think we've covered them all. So thank you, Jim. Thank you very, very much. Oh, one new message. Oh, someone posted some oak tree information that I think Bob talked about. I think we're done.
Okay, well, appreciate it. Thank you very much. And thank you, Linda and Marin County Free Library, for arranging this and for you hosting it. And thank you, Bob, for your assistance on the Q&A. Appreciate it.
Right. Guest appearance. Thank you all very much for attending.
Linda, I've got a question. There's a couple of people who had their hands up. I wasn't sure whether...
Oh, I don't see hands up. I've been monitoring the chat. We're getting a lot of, it was great. Thank you very much. Comments?
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you.
A new message. Oh, a thumb up from someone in the chat.
Okay. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you all.
All right. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.